Chocolate Day was never the loud one. It never demanded flowers or speeches or carefully timed surprises. For me, it had always been quieter than the rest. Something soft, almost private, like a shared understanding that didn't need to be explained. I woke up before my alarm that morning, the house still wrapped in that pale gray light that only exists before the day fully decides to begin. The floor felt cold under my feet as I walked into the kitchen, and for a moment I just stood there, listening. The refrigerator hummed softly. Somewhere outside, a car passed and disappeared. Nothing felt urgent, nothing felt off. I brewed coffee the way he liked it, strong, no sugar, and poured it into his favorite mug without thinking. My hands knew what to do before my mind even caught up. Some habits settle so deeply into your body that they stop feeling like choices. The chocolates were already on the counter, still in the bag from the night before. I'd spent more time choosing them than I wanted to admit, reading labels, comparing boxes, then finally picking the simplest one. Not flashy, not expensive, just familiar. Dark chocolate, his favorite. Chocolate Day wasn't about impressing. It was about choosing someone the same way, again and again. As I got dressed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I hadn't planned anything special, but somehow I looked intentional, comfortable, like someone who expected the day to unfold normally, without surprises, good or bad. I wasn't waiting for romance, I was waiting for presence. He kissed my cheek before leaving, quick and warm, already thinking about his day. "Busy one," he said, reaching for his keys. "I know," I replied, meaning it in that quiet way you do when schedules have become predictable. The door closed behind him, and the house returned to stillness. The morning moved forward the way it always did. Emails, laundry, a podcast playing softly in the background, more noise than information. Every so often, my eyes drifted back to the counter, to the chocolates waiting there, like a paused sentence. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed. A short message, ordinary, nothing that needed a response right away. I noticed the timestamp, noticed how brief it was, and then I told myself not to read into it. Busy days were normal. Silence didn't automatically mean distance. I'd learned not to create meaning where there didn't need to be any. At lunch, I stepped outside to clear my head. The cold air stung my cheeks as I walked past a cafe down the block, its windows decorated with simple brown and gold ribbons. No big signs, no hearts, just a quiet nod to the day. It made me smile. Chocolate Day didn't need to announce itself to matter. On my way back, I passed a woman carrying a small paper bag, holding it carefully like it contained something breakable. I wondered who she'd chosen it for. I wondered if she'd stood where I stood the night before, weighing options, assuming it would land exactly where it belonged. The afternoon felt slow but steady. I folded laundry and stacked his sweaters neatly, smoothing one out before placing it on the shelf. The familiar scent lingered on the fabric, and for a second I paused longer than necessary. It was strange how comfort could feel so physical. I checked the time, then stopped myself before checking it again. There was no reason to rush anything. Chocolate Day wasn't tied to a schedule. Still, as the light shifted and stretched across the living room floor, I found myself making small adjustments, straightening pillows, clearing space on the table, things that didn't need to be done but felt right to do anyway. My phone stayed quiet. I noticed that too, and just as quickly I dismissed it. Not every silence needed to be filled. Not every pause meant something was wrong. Trust lived in those gaps, and I believed in trust more than I believed in coincidence. As evening settled in, I lit a candle in the kitchen. Not for atmosphere, not for romance, just because it felt appropriate. The flame stayed steady, unbothered by the quiet around it. I placed the chocolates on the table, still unopened. Not as a statement, not as a test, just there. Chocolate Day wasn't about asking for proof of love. It was about assuming it already existed. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, feeling calm in that grounded way that comes from thinking you understand the shape of your life, from believing that the ordinary moments were exactly what made it solid. There was a thought that brushed the edge of my mind then, something small, unfinished. I didn't follow it. Finishing it would have meant questioning something I wasn't prepared to question, and the day hadn't given me a reason to do that. Not yet. At that moment, all I knew was this. I still believed. In routine, in intention, in the idea that love didn't always need to announce itself. Sometimes it just needed to arrive, quietly, the way it always had. And I was still waiting for it to do exactly that.
Chocolate Day didn't end loudly. It didn't collapse in a fight or fall apart with accusations. It just slid out of alignment. By mid-afternoon, the kitchen still smelled faintly like cocoa and coffee. The chocolates were where I'd left them, untouched, their wrapping smooth under my fingers when I passed by the counter again. I checked the time without meaning to, then checked it again, telling myself I was just keeping track of the day, not waiting. He had said he'd be late. Not late in a dramatic way, just late enough to be reasonable. Work ran long, a meeting went over, traffic. The usual soft explanations that never felt suspicious on their own. I nodded when he texted, even though he wasn't there to see it. I replied with something neutral, something easy. No pressure, no disappointment spelled out. Chocolate Day, after all, wasn't about demanding presents. It was about understanding. I moved the chocolates slightly, clearing space on the counter as if preparing for him to walk in at any moment. The small candle stayed unlit. There was no rush. I told myself evenings were better anyway, quieter, more honest. Outside, the day kept celebrating without us. Everywhere I looked, through store windows, scrolling past muted ads, even in the casual chatter I overheard while running a short errand, Chocolate Day was being treated like a shared secret. Everyone else already understood. Brown paper bags with satin ribbons, couples laughing in line, someone carrying a heart-shaped box like it was nothing at all. I didn't feel jealous, just slightly out of sync. When I came back home, the light had shifted. Afternoon warmth faded into something cooler. I turned on a lamp instead of the overhead lights, letting the room stay soft. The chocolates remained unopened. It felt important not to rush that moment, like opening them without him would change what they meant. Another message came in. Shorter this time, still polite, still normal. He said he'd eaten already, grabbed something quick between meetings. That should have meant nothing, and I told myself it meant nothing. I set the chocolates aside, not hidden, just moved, placed neatly near the edge of the table instead of centered like before. A small adjustment, one only I would notice. I poured a glass of water and stood there longer than necessary, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, grounding myself in ordinary sounds. This wasn't heartbreak. This was confusion with good manners. Later, while cleaning up, I noticed the receipt. It wasn't dramatic, just a folded slip of paper tucked into the pocket of his jacket when I went to hang it up. I wasn't searching, I wasn't snooping. It revealed itself the way small truths often do, casually, without intention. The logo caught my eye first, a place I didn't recognize. Then the timestamp, earlier than he'd said, earlier than the meeting that ran long. I didn't unfold it right away. I stood there holding the jacket, feeling the weight of the moment without naming it. My first instinct wasn't anger. It was restraint, a quiet sense that reacting too fast would mean misreading something I didn't fully understand yet. So I folded the receipt back exactly the way it had been. I told myself there were explanations. There were always explanations. Dinner passed without ceremony. The house stayed quiet, not tense, just still. When he finally came home, everything about him looked normal. His voice, his posture, the casual way he asked how my day was. He noticed the chocolates and smiled, almost absent-mindedly, like he appreciated the idea more than the timing. I smiled back. Chocolate Day, apparently, was flexible. We didn't talk about plans that never happened. We didn't mark the absence of the candle or the untouched box. There was no argument to avoid. Nothing had been promised out loud, which somehow made the silence easier to justify. Later that night, while he fell asleep, I lay awake longer than usual. Not spiraling, just thinking. I replayed the day the way you replay a conversation in your head, not to change it, but to understand where it shifted. The delayed texts, the receipt, the way everything technically made sense, yet didn't settle. What unsettled me most wasn't the possibility of betrayal, it was how carefully ordinary everything looked. There was dignity in not jumping to conclusions. I held on to that. I reminded myself that self-respect wasn't about suspicion, it was about patience, about allowing truth to reveal itself instead of forcing it into the open. Still, something had changed. The chocolates stayed unopened overnight. In the morning, I placed them back in the pantry instead of on the counter, not in frustration, just relocated, like a symbol being quietly retired before it lost its meaning entirely. Chocolate day had passed, but the sweetness hadn't landed where I had expected. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions framed like traps. I decided to watch, because whatever had slipped that day didn't feel like an accident, and I owed it to myself, not to react, but to understand, to see whether this was a single misalignment or the first visible crack in something I'd believed was solid. That night, as I turned off the lights, one thought stayed with me longer than the rest. Not painful, just steady. Hope hadn't shattered. It had just stopped expanding, and I noticed.
After chocolate day, nothing ended all at once. Things simply continued. That was the part that confused me the most at first. There was no dramatic shift, no apology conversation, no obvious distance. Just the same routines, moving forward like they always had. Mark still left his coffee mug by the sink in the mornings, still kissed my cheek when he passed behind me in the kitchen, still asked if I wanted anything from the store. And that normalcy almost worked. For a few days, I told myself I had imagined the heaviness of that evening, that the unopened chocolates sitting quietly in the pantry were just a coincidence, that one odd bank notification didn't mean anything on its own. Because love, real love, doesn't unravel in loud ways. It unravels when you stop looking directly at it. I didn't decide to investigate. I didn't make a plan. I simply started noticing. It began with time. Mark's schedule hadn't changed on paper, but the margins around it had. Meetings that used to end at 5 stretched to 6:30. Errands that once took 20 minutes now needed an hour. Nothing suspicious by itself, just expanded. I started paying attention to patterns instead of explanations. When he said traffic, it was always the same days of the week. When he said work ran late, it never happened on Fridays. When he said his phone battery died, it always seemed to happen when I wasn't home. I didn't question him. I didn't need to, because questions invite answers, and answers can still lie. Patterns don't. The second thing I noticed was money. Not because I was looking for something wrong, but because I was finally looking at everything together. We'd only shared finances openly. One joint account for household expenses, separate cards for personal spending. That transparency had been one of the quiet things I loved about our marriage. So when I pulled up the monthly statement one evening, it wasn't with suspicion, it was habit. Groceries, utilities, insurance. Everything looked normal. Until it didn't. There were charges that didn't fit into any routine we had built together. Small enough not to scream, consistent enough to whisper. Coffee shops across town, always mid-afternoon. Parking garages near places we never went. A boutique store I recognized, not from my life, but from a window I'd once paused in front of while waiting for a friend. Chocolate day came back to me then, not as a memory, but as a contrast. I remembered standing in that same store weeks earlier, choosing a simple box of chocolates based on what Mark liked. Dark, not too sweet, nothing fancy. And now here were purchases that carried the same softness, just directed elsewhere. Sweetness wasn't missing, it was being rerouted. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't even close the app immediately. I sat there longer than I needed to, letting the information settle without naming it. Because naming it would have turned it into something emotional. And this wasn't emotional anymore. It was factual. Over the next few days, I didn't dig. I layered. I noted dates, matched times, lined up receipts with calendar entries. When a charge appeared at 3:14 p.m.,
I checked where Mark said he was that afternoon. When a gap appeared in his schedule, I checked the pattern around it. There was a strange calm in it, not the numbness people talk about, something clearer. I wasn't hurt in the way I had been on chocolate day. That ache, the one that sat quietly in my chest, had already done its job. Now I was awake. One evening, while folding laundry, I found myself holding one of Mark's sweaters longer than necessary. It smelled the same, looked the same, and for the first time, that familiarity didn't comfort me. It explained something instead. Love had trained me to fill in gaps generously, to assume good intentions, to soften edges before they ever touched me. But awareness doesn't fill gaps, it measures them. I realized then that I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't building a case against my husband. I was building clarity for myself. And clarity doesn't rush. Chocolate Day had been about choosing sweetness intentionally, about care that showed up quietly, consistently. What I was seeing now was intention too, just not directed at me. That was the moment something shifted inside me, not painfully, not dramatically, but permanently. This was no longer about love, it was about truth, and truth doesn't need permission to exist. Once I saw that, my emotions changed texture. They became shorter, more contained. I stopped rereading messages for tone, stopped listening for subtext in his voice. I didn't need interpretation anymore. Facts were steadier than feelings. When Mark told me he'd be late one Thursday, I nodded and continued stirring the soup. When he mentioned a work dinner that hadn't been on the calendar, I smiled and asked if he wanted leftovers when he got back. Not because I was pretending, because I was done performing belief. At night, lying beside him, I noticed how easy it was to stay quiet now. Not because I was afraid to speak, but because silence had stopped feeling empty. It felt purposeful. I understood something important then. Love had made me patient, but awareness was making me precise, and precision doesn't announce itself. It waits. By the end of that week, I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't hoping. I was ready, not to accuse, not to confront, but to move forward with truth, calmly, lawfully, and on my terms.
I didn't rush into action after everything became clear. Clarity doesn't demand speed, it demands order. Once I understood that what I was dealing with wasn't confusion or coincidence, I slowed myself down intentionally, not out of fear, out of discipline. I kept living inside the same routine, but I stopped living inside the same assumptions. Morning coffee was still poured the same way, schedules were still discussed casually. Nothing on the surface suggested change. That was important, because emotional reactions create trails, and I didn't want to leave any. Instead, I began separating days into categories in my mind, days that were explained, days that weren't, days that repeated themselves without reason. Patterns don't need interpretation when they repeat with precision. They introduce themselves. I didn't confront anything. I didn't hint. I didn't test reactions. I simply started collecting what already existed. Statements that arrived automatically, dates that aligned too cleanly, amounts that didn't match the narrative I had been given. There was something grounding about it. Facts don't provoke emotion, they anchor it. At first, I thought I would feel anger while doing this, but what I felt instead was distance. Not coldness, distance. The kind that lets you see something clearly because you're no longer standing inside it. Chocolate Day crossed my mind often during those weeks, not because of disappointment, but because of contrast. That softness, that deliberate care, that belief that small intentional gestures were enough to hold something together. They hadn't been meaningless, they just hadn't been protective. I realized then that love without structure leaves too much room for erosion. The first professional conversation I scheduled wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fueled by emotion or urgency. It was simply a step toward understanding boundaries. I chose someone whose approach was calm, almost neutral, no emotional language, no moral commentary. I spoke slowly. I didn't overshare. I didn't frame anything as betrayal. I described sequences, timelines, numbers, gaps.
I remember pausing mid-sentence once, realizing how steady my voice sounded. That steadiness surprised me, not because I was pretending, but because I had already processed what mattered. The questions I asked weren't personal, they were clarifying. What carries weight? What establishes consistency? What requires time? There was no shock in the responses I received, no gasps, no judgment, just confirmation. And confirmation doesn't shout, it settles. From that moment on, my silence changed meaning. Before, silence had been patience. Now, silence was position. At home, nothing shifted outwardly. I didn't withdraw affection abruptly. I didn't demand explanations. I learned quickly that explanations are often used to rewrite timelines. Records don't do that. So I stayed observant. I adjusted my awareness, not my behavior. I noted when things were said casually that contradicted what I already knew. I didn't react. Reactions give people room to improvise. I wasn't interested in improvisation. I organized everything methodically, not obsessively, carefully. Dates lined up, accounts told the same story repeatedly, absences followed predictable patterns. What surprised me most was how little emotional energy it required once I stopped fighting reality. Resistance had been exhausting. Acceptance was efficient. There were moments, late at night, when I felt the weight of what I was preparing for. Not sadness, gravity. But even then, I didn't spiral. I grounded myself in process. Because process doesn't betray you. People do. Chocolate Day had once represented routine love to me. The idea that showing up quietly was enough. Now it represented something else. It represented awareness. The shift from sweetness to truth wasn't cruel, it was clarifying. I didn't need revenge to feel powerful, I needed alignment. As weeks passed, I became intentional about space, not physical distance, but mental clarity. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen, stopped imagining apologies that wouldn't change outcomes. I wasn't waiting to be chosen anymore, I was choosing order. Every step forward felt calm because it was informed. Nothing was impulsive, nothing was reactive. When I reviewed everything one final time, there was no dramatic realization, just confirmation layered over confirmation. That was when I knew I was ready. Not to confront, not to accuse, but to proceed. Silence no longer felt like restraint, it felt like control. And control, I learned, doesn't come from dominating someone else. It comes from understanding exactly where you stand and moving from there without hesitation. By the time the next phase became unavoidable, I wasn't bracing myself anymore. I was grounded. Chocolate Day no longer symbolized what I had hoped for. It symbolized what I had learned. That sweetness without structure fades, but clarity, handled quietly, creates stability. Everything was in place, and for the first time since that untouched box of chocolates sat waiting, I wasn't holding my breath. I was ready to let process speak where emotion once tried to.
The end did not arrive with noise. It arrived the way most permanent things do, quietly, methodically, without the need for witnesses. By the time everything reached its final stage, there were no unanswered questions left, no emotional loose ends waiting to be tied. No conversations left unfinished. What remained was a process that had already done its work long before the paperwork caught up. There were meetings, confirmations, timelines that no longer shifted. Each step felt procedural, almost neutral, as if the outcome had already decided itself weeks earlier. I didn't feel relief the way people describe it. I felt steadiness, the kind that doesn't come from winning, but from alignment. On the day everything concluded, I sat alone in a quiet office with clean walls and a narrow window that let in late afternoon light. The documents were laid out neatly in front of me, clipped, organized, final. I signed the last page without hesitation, no pause, no second look, just a clean line across the paper. That was it. There was no dramatic moment afterward, no phone call to make, no urge to tell anyone immediately. I gathered my things, thanked the people who had guided the process, and walked out the same way I had walked in, composed, contained, unchanged on the surface. What shifted happened internally. Outside, the city moved on at its usual pace. Traffic lights changed, people crossed streets without noticing me.
Life didn't acknowledge the ending, and that felt appropriate. My closure did not require public recognition. For the first time in a long while, my life felt structurally sound, not emotionally perfect, structurally honest. The days that followed were calm in a way I hadn't experienced before, not empty, not heavy, simply calm. My routines no longer adjusted around someone else's inconsistencies. My schedule didn't need to account for explanations that never fully explained anything. I woke up knowing what belonged to me, my time, my attention, my decisions. Financial clarity has a way of settling the nervous system. When everything is visible, accounted for, and accurate, there is nothing left to guess. The numbers didn't carry emotion, they carried truth, and that truth no longer required interpretation. I didn't check statements obsessively anymore. I didn't re-verify details just to reassure myself. Once order was restored, it stayed that way. Stability, I learned, doesn't demand constant monitoring. It holds. Emotionally, something subtle but important shifted. I wasn't trying to recover who I used to be. I realized then that I wasn't returning to myself. I was meeting myself, clearly, for the first time, without the need to explain my reactions, without the habit of minimizing discomfort, without negotiating my boundaries internally. I trusted my judgment again, not because I felt strong, but because I felt accurate. People often expect endings to come with forgiveness speeches or declarations of closure. Mine didn't. I didn't need to absolve or condemn anyone out loud. Accountability had already taken place quietly, through records, through timing, through facts that didn't bend. Silence, I learned, is powerful when it's chosen, not when it's forced. I didn't speak because I had nothing left to prove. Socially, my world remained intact. I didn't rewrite my story for public understanding. I didn't offer summaries or explanations unless they were necessary. The people who mattered recognized the shift without needing details. The rest continued as they always had, peripheral. Privacy became something I protected deliberately. It wasn't secrecy, it was ownership. With time, I noticed how much energy had once gone into maintaining emotional balance that was never mutual. Without that effort, my days felt proportionate again. Work regained its focus, conversations felt lighter, decisions became simpler. There was no dramatic sense of freedom, just balance. Months later, on an ordinary afternoon, I found myself in a grocery store without any particular intention. I walked familiar aisles absent-mindedly, letting routine guide me, and then I noticed it, the same section I had stood in on chocolate day. The display was smaller this time, different brands, different colors. The holiday had passed, and the shelves reflected that. Nothing about it asked for attention. I stood there briefly. I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel nostalgia. What I felt was perspective. Chocolate Day hadn't been foolish. It had been honest. The meaning didn't change. The context did. And context changes everything. Back then, chocolate symbolized care I believed was mutual, a small, intentional sweetness exchanged without conditions. Now it symbolized something quieter, my capacity to give sincerely, without calculation, and my responsibility to give wisely. Loving openly was never my mistake. Loving without evidence was. I didn't harden after that realization. I refined. There is a difference. Refinement keeps the essence intact while correcting the structure. I didn't become less generous. I became more precise about where generosity belonged. The end of my marriage did not leave a dramatic mark on my life. It left clarity. I didn't celebrate the outcome. I respected it. I respected the process that protected me without spectacle. I respected myself for not demanding noise where silence was enough. Today, my life feels quiet in a way that is intentional. I know what I allow. I know what I don't negotiate. My stability is no longer dependent on someone else's consistency. When I think about Chocolate Day now, I don't see it as a warning I missed or a moment I misunderstood. I see it as a point of reference, the day that showed me exactly how I loved, and eventually how I learned to love myself with the same care. Not louder, not colder, just clearer. and that clarity has been enough.